And joining us now is the Parliamentary Budget Officer, Kevin Page. It's nice to meet you. Nice to have you here at TVO.
Nice to be here, Steve.
We have had a lot of the heads of important public institutions in that chair. We'd like to invite you in and find out what it is that you do. So let's start there. What do you do?
Well, my job description is actually in the Parliament of Canada Act, and it says I provide independent analysis to parliamentarians and Canadians on trends in the economy, trends in the national finances, scrutiny of the estimates and costing.
How is that different from what a whole bunch of other smart people who know about the economy do?
Well, it's not that different in terms of what people do in central agencies in government, the Department of Finance and the Treasury Board Secretary, not that different. What's different is that we're actually providing this information to all parliamentarians, particularly to the opposition members.
Okay, in which case, you're the first, right?
Correct.
How was your office created in the first place?
It was created through the Accountability Act, which was passed in December 2008. It was a commitment by the Conservative government.
They brought it in and they've hired you.
Correct.
How'd you get the job?
Job interview. There was an interview panel. They were looking for people that had worked in central agencies in the budget environment, and eventually I was appointed by the Prime Minister on March 25th, 2008.
Okay. Let me read an excerpt from, this is from Bob Rae, now Liberal MP, but hearkening back to his experience as Premier of Ontario, quoted the National Post in February. "You will learn, as I did, that the estimates of finance officials are never quite on. That as the layoffs and bankruptcies pile up, government revenues collapse and expenditures grow. Your deficits will be higher than you think and say they are. You can bank on it." And I wonder if you think Bob Rae is right in that the estimates that finance officials give to the politicians that they serve, well, they're just not that good at projecting the numbers.
Well, it's a very humbling experience, actually, to be involved in the estimation game this time, particularly with the global recession, the way it came on so quickly, and just the deterioration of the Canadian economy in the fourth quarter, now the first quarter of 2009. I mean, it's true, actually, one of the reasons my office was created was sort of frustration. Through the 80s, we're underestimating deficits, and then through the 90s and the early part of this century, underestimating surpluses. And that has an impact on public finances. So, I mean, I think all economists, they do their best to forecast, the economy. At the end of the day, what we're doing is providing a planning kind of environment for parliamentarians.
But is the idea that your advice is considered less partisan, more neutral?
Well, I mean, it's our objective to be nonpartisan and independent in the provision of these estimates, so that we give parliamentarians a good idea of what they're going to face. In the case of 2009, a fairly significant recession. Okay,
let's just a little history here. We know that Jim Flaherty, the finance minister, was predicting balanced budgets right up until all hell broke loose, essentially. And we know that you were saying well before that that deficits were on the way. So you established some bona fides with that. They're now saying they meaning the Conservative government, intend to run $85 billion worth of deficits over the next 5 years. What do you think of the accuracy of that number?
Well, I mean, if they get the sort of their outlook for the Canadian economy, if they're right on the economic outlook, they'll probably be in that neighborhood. We think they're a little bit optimistic, particularly in their revenue projections. Their corporate profit projections are quite strong, according to our own estimates. But I mean, we're looking at probably 5 years of deficits right now, and that's because the Canadian economy is operating well below its potential.
Do you arrive at your budget deficit projection numbers in a different way from the way the finance minister does?
It's similar. We take averages of private sector forecasts. We do our own sort of fiscal projections, and it's a similar approach.
Okay, given your, let me say it, you don't want to say it, I understand. Given your more neutral approach to things, do you have any different insight on when this great recession might be over?
No, I think all economists are struggling right now to see when the bottom is going to be. I think most people are saying that we'll hit bottom sometime in 2009. Hopefully, things start to turn up in the fall of 2009. But I think the unfortunate thing about this type of recession, it's global, it's synchronized, and it's also quite deep. And what precipitated was a financial crisis. And when we see kind of recessions that are precipitated by a financial crisis, they tend to last for a long period of time.
Okay, you referred a few minutes ago to the deteriorating revenue situation for governments as to one reason why the deficits potentially may be worse than what the government anticipates today. So let's focus on the revenues. The unemployment rate is now up to 8%. At what point does that rate become a problem for government finances, because fewer people are working, fewer people are paying income taxes, and therefore the government's revenues for income tax purposes go down too much?
It's a problem right now, actually, and we're seeing revenue go slow, and that's it's really the big reason why we're going to see fairly significant deficit in 2009. Even before the stimulative measures that was put in by the government, we're probably looking at a deficit of about $15 billion in 2009-10. And then you add in a stimulus of upwards of $20 billion. You're looking at a fairly significant deficit in absolute dollar terms.
Do you want to make a projection on what you think it's going to be for the fiscal year we're in?
Well, we're looking, most economists are saying, based on a recession of about 2.5% negative growth in 2009, probably looking at a deficit of around $40 billion.
$40 billion for 1 year?
For 1 year, which would be about 2% of GDP. $40 billion in absolute dollar terms seems like a big number, relative to our experiences in the 1990s. But again, relative to our economy, about 2%. It's a lot less than a lot of other economies are experiencing right now. So we're actually in a lot better position than most of our competitors.
That sounds like a huge number, though. Would you agree with that?
Well, it is a big number. Politically, I think it's a number that has a lot of sting to it as well. But again, relative to our size of economy, relative to our trading partners, 2% deficit. Given the nature of this recession, we're in much better shape than most of our trading partners.
And I guess Kim Campbell's government had a deficit over $40 billion on a budget that was a lot smaller. So
correct.
That was more egregious.
And a size of economy as well that was much smaller.
Right. The Conservatives, as we well know, cut the GST by 2 percentage points, and revenues, not surprisingly, shrank. How much would you point to the declining sales tax revenues as that being the reason versus the general recession?
It's the general recession that's causing this deficit right now. My office, we provide estimates what we call structural budget balances, which is basically what would the balance be if the economy was operating near its potential. And we're saying right now that we're roughly in balance structurally. So if the economy gets back to potential, we're out of these cyclical deficits, we're back to budget balance. So that, there's a lot of economists debate whether or not we should have cut the GST or not. It didn't lead to this sort of cyclical deficit that we're experiencing now.
Didn't lead to it, but I'm going to challenge you. There weren't that many economists debating whether it was a good or a bad thing to do. I think virtually every economist I know, except one, who happens to be the Prime Minister, thought it was a dumb thing to do. You want to agree with that? That's the shortest answer I've ever received to any question I've ever asked.
Sorry.
Now, how come no answer to that one?
Well, I mean, it's not our mandate to get involved in sort of these policy discussions. For the most part, we're economists. We provide sort of financial analysis.
Okay. How about lower oil prices? How much is that affecting revenue?
Well, we're seeing some strength in recent days in oil prices globally. It's having a big impact, and I think most people's planning assumptions that we'll probably see oil kind of at current levels now for the next year or so. And what's depressing that is weak global demand.
Let's talk about expenditures. Government plans to spend billions, as you know, to stimulate the economy with these so-called shovel-ready projects. From a budgeting standpoint, how wise is this?
Well, if you actually look at the national accounts and you look at all the components of demand, the only thing that's actually growing right now is government expenditure. Consumer expenditure is declining, business investment is declining, trade is being a drag on the economy. So we actually need government expenditures right now. I think international organizations like the IMF are encouraging all countries to contribute. Canada, we're in a relatively good position, so we can contribute to strengthening the economy right now.
I know you're not the Auditor General, but when money goes out the door this fast, and I know the opposition say it's not going out fast enough right now, that plans have been made, expenditures have been approved, but the money's not going out fast enough. But the idea is to get it out the door fast so that people can get hired. How concerned do you get that the money is being spent wisely?
Well, I think there are those concerns. I think the government, Mr. Flaherty's expressed those concerns as well. I mean, I think now we have quarterly reports, which I think is a good thing. It was it's part of the Budget Implementation Act. So every quarter we're going to get sort of a progress report on where we're at in terms of flowing the money, and I think that's good. So we'll see the pace of the money going out, and we'll get to track to see where that money is being spent and what output is actually what outcomes it's actually achieving.
Okay, let me ask you about the other big expenditure, employment insurance. You well know there's a huge debate in the country about this right now, big one in Parliament as well. I think there are almost 60 different criteria by which the employment insurance rates are figured out. It's different from city to city, and it's different obviously for province to province. Ontario being one of the hardest hit in terms of unemployment right now, and certainly the opposition want more generous benefits for those who are suffering. They also say, the opposition, they want a more uniform and a more generous system. And I want you to help us understand what the implications to the country's finances are if we do that.
Well, it would be more expensive. They haven't asked us, my office, the Parliamentary Budget office, or the Office of the Parliamentary Budget Officer, to look at that particular issue. I mean, I think the context for that, though, which we've been pretty clear about, is we've seen massive job losses, almost unprecedented job losses since October. So there's good reason to be concerned about that. And when you look at the number of unemployed relatively to the number of beneficiaries, that ratio has changed dramatically. So we do need to look at it. It will cost money for sure, though.
If they asked you for a view on whether they should reform it closer to what the opposition wants, would you give them that advice?
We'll give them financial analysis, and we'll look at different options, what it would cost. We could provide some independent costing on that.
Any ballpark sense about what, for example, Mr. Ignatieff's plan would cost if the Liberals were to have their way?
We haven't seen it. We haven't costed it, rather.
Okay. I mean, is it possible it's 25 billion more, 50 billion more?
Well, that'd be over many years.
Okay. Let me quote you, because I want to ask you about your office. Here's what you told the Parliamentary Standing Committee. I will not sacrifice the integrity and nonpartisanship of this position, given the context in which it was created. At this juncture, budget reductions and administrative controls are being used to undermine the integrity of the legislation, my position, and the PBO function. In short, I will no longer be able to fulfill the mandate prescribed by Parliament. This is all about the fact that I guess it was the National Post back in December that reported your office's budget was going to be reduced by 33%. So we're 5 months later now, 6 months later. Has the budget of your office, in fact, been reduced?
Yes.
By how much?
Roughly by about a third.
So
yeah.
we got that right.
We were planning on a budget of 2.8 million, and we were told now to plan on a budget of 1.8 million. There's discussions going on, at parliamentary committees right now about restoring the budget. I mean, we're at a critical juncture right now. I mean, when you think about what our task is, our legislative mandate, as I've kind of articulated earlier, you've got basically $240 billion of expenditures to scrutinize. You've got a $1.7 trillion economy to analyze and look at trends. You need the basic resources to do that. So we're at a point now where it's very hard to get the work out the door. And it's in a very important junction to be providing this work.
I appreciate the fact that nobody wants to see their office budget go down. That goes without saying. But I think our viewers want to know what would be the ramifications of a cut of the magnitude you're talking about to what enabling you to do what you do.
I mean, right now we provide, in advance of the government's quarterly reports, or even in advance of fiscal updates and budgets, an independent kind of outlook on where the economy is going, those fiscal projections. We provided costings and fairly significant engagements. And if we don't get these resources, I mean, it'll be very hard for us to continue to provide that level of resources, that level of capacity for parliamentarians. So I think the level of debate suffers a little bit, and I think parliamentarians, I think even Canadians lose.
Your office is a bit like the Congressional Budget Office in the United States. Do you know how many employees they've got?
They have about 250.
250. How many have you got?
I have a dozen.
You have a dozen. So even given the factor of 10, which we always use, your office staff is half as much as big as theirs.
Yes.
Who wants to cut your budget by a third?
I mean, it's actually, I honestly don't know. Whether or not it's a bureaucratic decision or a political decision. Certainly, we've sort of made some ways by providing some of the products that we've released. That may be part of it.
Well, that's what I'm trying to find out. Do you know if it's a political decision or a bureaucratic decision?
I honestly don't know.
You don't know. So you don't know if your fight, in fact, is with the Harper government over this, or whether it's with the Librarian of Parliament, to whom you directly report.
I know I need the resources to do the job.
But if you need those resources, presumably you have to make your case to those who can make it happen. Who are you making your case to? Well,
we were at as you quoted me last week, I was in front of a joint committee, a House and Senate committee last week, making the case.
So that suggests that the politicians are the people you need to lobby.
But at the end of the day, it's the politicians. They will decide on my budget, and they will decide on the kind of parliamentary budget officer, the role that they want this parliamentary budget officer to play.
Do you feel at the moment, I don't want to make this like needlessly personal, but do you feel like you're in the middle of a bit of a, I got to be careful I don't use the wrong language. Let's call it a political showdown. You feel like you're in the middle of one right now?
Well, I think it's a showdown of sorts. And I was kind of told to expect this. You mentioned earlier the Congressional Budget Office. When they were creating their office, that type of capacity, bringing it online, I think there was a period of time for people to adjust. In their case, Congress. In our case, Parliament, parliamentarians. So there is a bit of a showdown right now. I think hopefully it's a period that we'll get through.
What do you think the future of your office is?
Strong. Just because we need an office like this in Canada. We need to level the playing field between the executive side and the overall legislature in terms of analysis on budgetary issues. At the end of the day, the power of the purse rests with Parliament.
And you work for the legislature?
That's correct.
You told me before we started this that you used to have a job in the bureaucracy in Ottawa where you just wallowed in wonderful obscurity. You do not wallow in obscurity anymore. Your picture's in the paper all the time, you're on the news all the time, you get quoted all the time. Do you like it better that way?
No.
That's what you signed up for.
Well, if it's part of the job in terms of explaining what our office is about, for sure. If it's part of the scrutiny in terms of as we release products, I think there's a role to be scrutinized, whether it's in front of committee or in front of the media. I'm prepared to do that.
Well, we thank you for doing some of it here tonight at TVO.
Honored
Kevin
to.
Page, Parliamentary Budget Officer. Thanks so much.
Honored to be here.